There is a ceiling in Rome that has been looked at for 500 years, and almost no one has seen what is actually painted on it. Not the thunderous God reaching toward Adam in the ark of creation, not the prophets occupying their architectural thrones at the vault's edge, not the sibyls with their enormous books and their expressions of something between inspiration and grief. What has gone unseen for most of those 500 years is a shape embedded in the center of one of the most reproduced compositions in the history of Western art. A shape whose outline does not emerge from casual looking, whose meaning requires a specific kind of anatomical literacy to read, and whose presence, once it is registered, changes what the painting is about at a level that no contract survives to address. The panel is the creation of Adam. The shape, identified by a physician examining a reproduction in 1990, is the human brain in mid-sagittal cross-section, encoded inside the billowing red cloak that carries God and his surrounding figures across the ceiling's center. Michelangelo had spent more time with human cadavers than almost any other painter of his generation. He understood the brain's architecture with a precision that the anatomical illustrations of his period were only beginning to approach. And in the center panel of the most scrutinized ceiling in the world, he appears to have placed that knowledge inside an image of divine creation in a way that could not be named, could not be contracted for, and could not be seen from the floor of the chapel 60 feet below the painted vault. It waited there, in the plaster and the pigment, for 5 centuries before the right question was put to it. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The commission that produced the Sistine ceiling was not one Michelangelo sought or welcomed. He was 33 years old in 1508. Already famous in Rome for the Pieta he had carved for St. Peter's Basilica before he was 25 years old, and for the David completed in Florence in 1504, the largest freestanding marble figure produced since antiquity. His reputation was as a sculptor of stone, and that reputation was not incidental to his identity. He had told Julius II precisely this, and Julius, who was not a man accustomed to being told the limits of what his commissions could demand, had proceeded with the ceiling commission regardless. The original terms were, by the standards of what the project eventually became, modest: 12 apostles placed in the spandrels above the chapel's windows, and a decorative geometric pattern to cover the remaining vault. Within months of beginning, the scope had grown into something without precedent. The documentation of how that expansion was negotiated is incomplete. No revised contract survives that names who proposed the 300 figures that would eventually cover the vault, or what the artist said when he absorbed the full weight of what the new program required. What is certain is that by 1512, when the scaffolding came down and the doors of the chapel were opened, the ceiling contained a narrative cycle running from the separation of light and darkness through the story of Noah, a border system of ignudi and prophets and sibyls, and at its center, the 9 panels of Genesis, whose composition had transformed what European painting understood itself capable of doing. The challenge that the commission represented was not only physical, though it was that as well. It was the challenge of producing a theological program of this scale, with complete authority over a surface that no one had ever been asked to fill in this way, and of doing so in a medium in which Michelangelo had no established practice, and which his first attempts on the fresh plaster revealed to him, in the early months, as significantly more demanding than the contract had suggested. The physical conditions under which the work was made are documented in letters that survive in the Buonarroti archive in Florence. Writing to his father in 1510, Michelangelo described the strain on his neck, his back, and his eyes in terms that are specific and not rhetorical. A drawing survives in his own hand, annotated with a short verse, showing him at work, neck bent at the extreme angle required by the curved vault surface above him. One arm raised toward the plaster, the brush oriented upward so that the paint falls back toward his upturned face. He described in the verse what the posture had done to his body. His beard pointed toward heaven, his chest had come to resemble a harpy's, the brush dripping color above him had turned his face into a tiled floor. The verse is self-deprecating in tone, the complaint of a man who has decided to endure his conditions rather than surrender to them, but what it records is the sensitivity to bodily mechanics of a man who had spent years studying how the body looks and moves and holds itself under pressure. Michelangelo's knowledge of how bodies work was not only theoretical, and it was not only the refined observation of an artist accustomed to drawing from life. It was knowledge acquired through the direct examination of bodies opened on the dissecting table, through the experience of handling the interior structures of the human frame in conditions of physical intimacy that almost no other painter of his period had sought or sustained. That knowledge did not leave him when he climbed the scaffold each morning. It was the instrument with which he looked at the figures he was painting, and the instrument with which, if the anatomical argument is correct, he made decisions about what to place inside a billowing cloak 60 feet above the floor of the papal chapel. His formal anatomical study had begun in Florence in his late teens, when the prior of Santo Spirito, the Augustinian prior Niccolo Bicchiolini, had arranged for Michelangelo to examine bodies from the hospital's mortuary. The arrangement emerged from Michelangelo's connection to the Medici household and produced a wooden crucifix that Michelangelo carved for the prior in exchange for the access. The crucifix disappeared from the historical record and was only plausibly re-identified in the 1980s, when a carved wooden figure at the Casa Buonarroti was examined by scholars whose attribution argument has since been debated but not dismissed. The dissections that his time at Santo Spirito permitted were not occasional or superficial. Michelangelo worked through the night on bodies that the hospital's dead house could not store beyond a very limited period, and he examined the muscular layers in the sequence that a sculptor would approach them. The surface forms first, the structures that give the exterior its shape and motion, then the deeper tissues beneath, the tendons and ligaments and bones and the chambers of the chest and abdomen. Giorgio Vasari, in the Lives of the Artists, first published in 1550 and significantly expanded in 1568, recorded that Michelangelo had accumulated anatomical knowledge sufficient to produce a treatise that would have been comparable to the systematic account of the body that Andreas Vesalius assembled for De Humani Corporis Fabrica, published in 1543. Michelangelo's treatise was never finished, and the manuscripts, if they ever existed in consolidated form, did not survive him. What survived is the evidence of that knowledge distributed across decades of drawings held in Windsor, in the Uffizi, and in the Albertina, and across the marble and plaster surfaces of a career that lasted more than 70 active years. The brain, among all the organs he would have examined, held a position in the intellectual landscape of his formation that made it more than a technical object. It was the seat of the question that the Florentine Neoplatonist circle had debated throughout his adolescence, and that the commission he was now working inside could not openly address. The circle of scholars and philosophers gathered at the Palazzo Medici under Lorenzo de' Medici's patronage in the 1480s and 1490s included Marsilio Ficino, whose translations of the Platonic dialogues and of the Hermetic corpus had introduced into Florentine intellectual life a sustained engagement with questions about the soul and its relationship to the body that did not sit comfortably alongside orthodox theological positions. Where does the soul reside in the body? Through what mechanism does thought arise from physical tissue? Is the mind a product of the brain's operations, or does it use the brain as an instrument without being reducible to it? These questions were not peripheral to the culture in which Michelangelo spent his formative years as a resident guest of the Medici household. They were among its central preoccupations, and the men conducting those debates were people whose work he had read and whose conversations he had access to during the years when his intellectual formation was occurring. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, whose oration on the dignity of man was read within the same circle, and who argued for the human capacity to ascend toward the divine through the exercise of intellect, was part of the same intellectual world. Ficino's argument that the soul is drawn toward its divine origin through contemplation, through the exercise of the mind, positioned the thinking faculty not as incidental to the soul's nature, but as central to it. The idea that a man formed in this environment, carrying these questions along with his anatomical knowledge onto the scaffold of the Sistine Chapel, might have found a way to embed a statement about the relationship between the divine gift of consciousness and the physical organ that houses it, is not implausible on its face. The difficulty is in demonstrating intention when the documentary record has left no trace of it. The panel that Meshberger examined in 1990 is the 9th panel of the narrative sequence, and the one that anchors the entire ceiling's meaning. A reclining Adam, newly formed and not yet fully animated, extends his left arm along the full width of the composition toward a god who reaches back from a swirling mass of figures and drapery. The famous gap between the two index fingers, not quite touching, not quite separated, holds whatever the painting believes about the transmission of life from the divine to the human. God is shown airborne and propulsive, his body carried across the composition by a billowing red cloak that extends behind him and downward, enclosing a cluster of figures whose identities have been debated since the 16th century. Most commentary identifies these figures as angels. The standard reading of the cloak treats it as a compositional device, a way of grouping the surrounding figures around the divine presence and suggesting celestial motion through the gathered weight and direction of the fabric. Meshberger's paper, published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1990, under the title An Interpretation of Michelangelo's Creation of Adam Based on Neuroanatomy, placed that billowing red shape beside a standard anatomical illustration of the human brain in mid-sagittal section, and argued that the correspondence between the two was not incidental. The lower border of the cloak, the line running beneath God and the assembled figures, traces the ventral surface of the brainstem with a precision that the compositional logic of drapery and motion does not straightforwardly explain. The inner curve of the upper cloak, arching over the figures inside it, follows the sulci of the cerebral cortex. A partially visible figure at the lower rear of the group, whose foot extends beyond the cloak's outer edge, corresponds in both position and form to the pituitary stalk in the cross-sectional diagram. The green scarf trailing from the lower margin of the composition, the detail that most art historical commentary had treated as decorative or compositionally incidental, corresponds in shape and placement to the vertebral artery as it appears in the same anatomical view. Meshberger did not frame his reading as a claim about Michelangelo's private psychology or his unspoken heterodoxies. He argued that the anatomy was present in the composition as a theological statement, embedded rather than announced, that the divine gift transmitted from God to Adam in the panel is specifically the capacity for consciousness, and that Michelangelo had located the transmission inside a diagram of the organ that sustains it. God, in this reading, is not giving Adam breath or generic life force. He is giving him mind, and the shape of what is being given is the brain itself, drawn by the man who had handled it on the dissecting table and who understood its form from inside. There is also the question of what the composition does to the figures inside the cloak, beyond placing them in a brain-shaped outline. The figure identified by most commentators as a woman, shown cradled under God's left arm at the rear of the cloak, has generated subsidiary debates that the anatomical reading does not resolve but does reframe. If the enclosing shape is the brain, then the figures inside it are figures inside the mind, the divine mind at the moment of transmitting consciousness, and their arrangement becomes something more charged than a gathering of attendant angels. Some researchers have noted that the figure under God's arm corresponds in position to the soul, in certain Neoplatonist accounts, as it awaits transmission into the newly formed body below. The painting does not annotate this. It does not label its figures or explain their positions. It shows what it shows, and what it shows, once the anatomical reading is placed beside it, is a composition in which the theological narrative of the commission and the anatomical knowledge of the painter have been made to occupy the same space without announcing themselves as the same thing. Whether this was the product of a deliberate decision, a sustained intellectual strategy, or something that emerged from the act of composition in ways that even Michelangelo may not have fully articulated to himself, is not a question the paint can answer. What the paint shows is a structure that works simultaneously as divine narrative and anatomical diagram, and the fact that it took 5 centuries and the combination of medical knowledge and photographic reproduction to make the second reading available does not diminish the specificity of the correspondence or the improbability of its occurrence by accident alone. The context of how Michelangelo worked on the scaffold also matters to this question in ways that are not often considered. He did not simply paint from drawings produced at a distance. The buon fresco technique that he used for the passages he considered most critical required that the pigment be applied to fresh wet plaster within a limited working window before the plaster set. Each section of fresh plaster, each giornata, was prepared and painted in a single sustained working session. This means that the compositions Michelangelo painted in buon fresco were not open to later revision in the way that a painting on panel or canvas might be adjusted after the initial session. What went into the wet plaster was committed. The decisions that produced the outline of the cloak in the creation of Adam, including the decisions about where the lower border would run, how the inner curve of the upper cloak would follow the figures inside it, and where the green scarf would trail from the composition's lower margin, were decisions made in the moment of painting by a man who had studied human anatomy for decades and who was working alone on a surface that no other eye at close range would examine while he was alive. The scaffold was his, the plaster was wet. What he put into it was put in without revision and without witness. It is still there. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The response to Meshberger's paper divided along lines that have remained fairly consistent in the decades since. Art historians were largely resistant, citing the absence of any documentary confirmation from Michelangelo himself or from any contemporary witness to his intentions. No surviving letter names an anatomical program. No account by Condivi, who wrote the first biography of Michelangelo under the artist's direct supervision and cooperation, mentions the brain or the cloak in terms that would support the reading. Vasari, who expanded Michelangelo's biography in 1568, 4 years after the artist's death, discusses the creation of Adam in terms of its narrative and compositional achievement without any reference to anatomical embedding. The silence of the biographical record is absolute. Medical professionals and anatomists engaged more directly with the specifics of the visual correspondence, noting that the match between the cloak's outline and the anatomical cross-section is precise in multiple independent details simultaneously, rather than resembling the brain only in its general oval shape, and arguing that the hypothesis of accidental correspondence requires a sequence of coincidences in independent structural details that becomes progressively less plausible the more carefully those details are enumerated. The debate generated follow-on publications. In 2010, the Brazilian researchers Yilson Barreto and Marcelo de Oliveira extended the anatomical argument to a second panel at the altar end of the vault, the separation of light and darkness, where God's foreshortened neck and exposed throat, seen from directly below, produce an outline they argued corresponds to the brainstem and the upper spinal cord. The second argument is narrower in scope, and the visual correspondence somewhat less immediately persuasive than Meshberger's central claim, but it operates from the same premise, that Michelangelo's anatomical knowledge was present and active on the scaffold across the full 4 years of the commission, that it left traces in the compositions he painted there, and that those traces were designed to remain invisible to anyone standing on the floor 60 feet below the vault's surface. That invisibility from the floor was a structural condition of the ceiling's display from the moment the scaffolding came down. The Sistine Chapel is approximately 40 meters long and 13 meters wide. The vault rises to approximately 20 meters at its highest point. The figures painted on that vault are scaled specifically to compensate for the foreshortening that the extreme upward angle of viewing produces. The heads are disproportionately large relative to the bodies, the limbs elongated, the compositions adjusted to remain legible as scenes, rather than as abstract shapes when seen from the floor far below. Michelangelo understood these calculations and applied them with documented care, producing smaller trial figures and having them raised to the vault level to test their legibility from the floor before committing them to the wet plaster. The ceiling was made for the eye at ground level, which means it was made to be read as narrative, not as outline. An outline visible only when the composition is reproduced on a flat surface and examined at the close distance of ordinary reading is an outline that the chapel's conditions of display prevented from being read as an outline for as long as the chapel remained the only place the image existed. From the floor, you see the scene inside the cloak. You do not see the cloak as a silhouette. The shape reads as a shape only when the panel is reproduced in a form that allows the eye to examine the composition's outer contour at the distance of a printed page or a screen, which is to say from a viewing position that did not exist between 1512 and the 20th century. Whether this built-in invisibility was by design is the question that the documentary record cannot settle, and that the paint itself cannot directly answer. A man who wanted to encode a theological statement that his commission could not authorize would have every reason to place it in a silhouette, visible only from the scaffold's close range, and not from the floor of the chapel below. He would have reason not to write it down, not to describe it to the assistants who worked alongside him in the early months before he dismissed most of them, and not to reference it in the letters that the Buonarroti archive has preserved. The complete absence of documentation for an intention that would have exposed Michelangelo to serious ecclesiastical consequences if made explicit is not, by itself, evidence against the intention. It is the shape of what deliberate concealment looks like in the historical record, a gap where the documentation would be, surrounding an object where the evidence is. The institutional context that explains why a concealment of this kind would have been necessary is provided in part by what happened to the other major work, The Last Judgment, completed in 1541 on the altar wall directly beneath the vault he had painted in 1512, depicted the resurrected dead and the condemned with a directness about the human body, its mass and physical exposure, and the weight of suffering flesh, that generated a controversy the work has not entirely escaped in the 5 centuries since. Pietro Aretino published in 1545 a formal attack on the painting that named specific figures and accused the work of treating a sacred subject with a license appropriate only to a pagan setting. After Michelangelo's death in 1564, the Council of Trent's conclusions about nudity in sacred imagery were applied to the Last Judgment, and Daniele da Volterra was contracted to paint fabric over the most exposed figures. Da Volterra spent years on the commission and was never afterward discussed in connection with the chapel, without the name that followed him permanently, Il Braghettone, the trouser maker. His alterations survive on the wall today alongside Michelangelo's original pigment, a palimpsest in which institutional anxiety about the body is physically deposited over the surface of the art that exceeded its brief. The creation of Adam was painted more than 30 years before that controversy. The theological implication it might carry is not about the visibility of the body in a sacred space. It concerns what the soul is, where consciousness comes from, and whether the organ that sustains thought is incidental to or constitutive of the mind's nature. An orthodox account of the scene holds that God's creative act transmits an immaterial soul entirely from outside the body. What the brain reading implies is that Michelangelo painted a version of that scene in which the divine gift arrives through an image of the organ that makes thought possible. That is not what the commission asked for. Whether it is what the painter put there is a question that the Plaster holds and the documents do not. Michelangelo died on the 18th of February, 1564, in Rome, at the age of 88. He had outlived Julius II by more than 50 years, outlived the Medici humanists whose questions had formed him, outlived Vasari's first account of his career, and lived to collaborate on the second. He had also outlived the Pietà, the David, the Sistine ceiling, the tomb of Julius that Julius's executors reduced from the monument Michelangelo had designed into the truncated version visible today in San Pietro in Vincoli, and the Last Judgment, which was already being criticized before he died. In the years before his death, he destroyed a substantial portion of his drawings and preparatory work, according to Condivi and Vasari both, for reasons that neither biographer accounts for consistently. Vasari attributed the destruction to a desire to prevent the evidence of struggle and revision from surviving alongside the finished work. Condivi's account is less specific. The true reason, if there was a single one, did not make it into the biographical record. What also did not make it into that record is any account of what the Sistine ceiling's compositions were designed to contain, beyond their named narrative subjects. The drawings, the notes, the working decisions made on the scaffold in the 4 years between 1508 and 1512, these are gone. What remains is the ceiling itself, which was cleaned in the restoration campaign that ran between 1980 and 1999, generating a body of high-resolution photographic documentation that made the ceiling's surface available for examination at a level of detail and at a range of viewing distances that had never been possible before. The cleaned surface disclosed a palette that no pre-campaign reproduction had captured and brought the anatomical precision of Michelangelo's figures into clarity that centuries of accumulated deposit had obscured. Meshberger's paper appeared in 1990 during the campaign, working from documentary photographs that the restoration had produced. The anatomical argument is not possible from the floor of the chapel. It becomes possible from a photograph at the distance of ordinary reading. It became possible in 1990 because the restoration had produced, for the first time, photographs of the ceiling at a resolution and from a viewpoint that made the question Meshberger asked available to be asked. The ceiling is still in Rome. The panel is at its center, 60 feet above the floor of a building that receives several million visitors each year. Most of those visitors look at the finger gap first, the famous almost contact between the two outstretched hands. They look at the figure of Adam, his reclining weight and his extended arm. They look at God and at the faces of the surrounding figures. Very few of them look at the outline of the red cloak as an outline. The conditions of display do not encourage it. The crowds do not permit it. The light and the distance and the habit of looking for scenes rather than silhouettes all work against it. But the shape is there. It has been there since 1512. It is in the outer and inner contours of the red cloak, in the placement of the figures inside it, in the correspondence of the green scarf with the vertebral artery, in the position of the partially visible figure at the rear of the composition. Every independent anatomical detail that Meshberger named in 1990 remains in the composition and has not been dislodged by subsequent examination. What Michelangelo intended by it is the question the surviving documentation will not resolve. What the paint answers is that the shape is there, that it is precise rather than approximate, that it was made by the most anatomically knowledgeable painter of the Italian Renaissance in the center panel of the most ambitious commission of his career, and that the conditions under which it was displayed for 5 centuries made it invisible until photography and medical knowledge together made the question possible to ask. The question was asked in 1990. The shape was found. The shape was always there. If you look at a reproduction of the creation of Adam now, with the question Meshberger asked available to you, you are not looking at the same painting you looked at before. The ceiling has been waiting for exactly this kind of attention since the morning Julius II stood at the floor of the Sistine Chapel and looked up at what a 33-year-old sculptor had placed in the plaster above the altar of the most powerful institution in Western Christendom. It will go on waiting in the same plaster long after the last eye that reads these words has closed. The painting's survival across 500 years is its own argument. The Sistine Chapel has been damaged, repainted, bombed within range, and overwhelmed by the presence of 6 million annual visitors who exhale moisture into a space that the plaster was not built to sustain at that volume. The restoration campaign addressed some of these conditions without fully resolving any of them. The ceiling is stable now in ways it was not in the 1970s, when the decision to begin the cleaning was made partly because inaction had become its own form of damage. What the campaign also produced, as a secondary effect of its photographic documentation, was the closest look that any generation since the early 16th century has had at what Michelangelo actually painted. The colors that emerged from beneath the accumulated grime were not what anyone had anticipated. The tonal relationships between the figures, the specific quality of the light modeling across the bodies of the prophets and the ignudi, the palette of the narrative panels at the center of the vault, all of these were different in ways that required the scholarly community to revise accounts of Michelangelo's chromatic practice that had been built on the pre-cleaning surface. The anatomical reading emerged from the same photographic documentation. It was available for the same reason, not because the brain had been invisible before, but because the photographs produced by the restoration campaign allowed the composition to be examined at a distance and a viewing angle that the chapel itself had never permitted. Seeing the ceiling clearly, for the first time, meant seeing it differently. It is possible that the anatomical reading was the first thing that became newly visible, and it is also possible that it was not the last. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.